What if Caligula wasn't insane, but a genius of political psychological terror? On Palatine Hill, Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, stood before the ornate windows of his palace. It was 38 CE, barely a year into his reign, and the young emperor who had once been Rome's beloved prince was already becoming something the Senate had never foreseen. The senators who had celebrated his ascension now whispered in the corridors of the Curia Julia, their voices heavy with growing concern. What they witnessed was not the madness history would later claim, but something far more calculated and dangerous, a systematic dismantling of the traditional power structures that had governed Rome for centuries. Marcus Junius Silanus, one of the most respected senators, had been the first to truly understand what was happening. During a routine Senate session, Caligula had demanded that senators prostrate themselves before him in the manner of Eastern potentates. The request was not born of insanity, but of a deliberate strategy to humiliate the very institution that had once held supreme power in Rome. The emperor's eyes, cold and calculating, surveyed the assembled senators who hesitated to comply. This was not the behavior of a deranged ruler, but of a political genius who understood that power was not just about commanding armies, it was about breaking the spirit of those who might challenge him. The transformation had begun subtly. Caligula started by demanding that senators attend him at dawn, forcing aging men to rise before sunrise and wait for hours in the cold marble halls. He would then cancel meetings at the last moment, leaving them exhausted and humiliated. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were carefully orchestrated demonstrations of his absolute authority. Senator Gaius Asinius Pollio, grandson of the famous orator, was among the first to experience Caligula's new methods. During a Senate debate about grain distribution, Pollio had dared to question the emperor's extravagant spending on games and spectacles. The response was swift and calculated. Within days, Pollio found himself summoned to the palace at irregular hours. He was forced to stand for hours while Caligula attended to other matters, deliberately ignored, then dismissed without explanation. The message was clear. The Senate's traditional role as advisors and deliberators was over. They were now merely ornaments in the emperor's court. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual humiliation. Caligula began requiring senators to participate in his theatrical performances, forcing dignified men who had once commanded legions to dress as actors and perform in comedies before jeering crowds. This was not madness. It was a calculated assault on the dignity that gave the Senate its authority. The emperor understood that Roman society was built on concepts of honor, dignity, and traditional roles. By systematically destroying these foundations, he was not just entertaining himself, he was reshaping the very nature of Roman governance. The Senate, once the deliberative body that had guided Rome through centuries of expansion and crisis, was being reduced to a collection of frightened courtiers. As the chapter of traditional senatorial power closed, a new and more terrifying era was beginning. The young emperor had learned that true power came not from the consent of the governed, but from their complete submission, and he was just getting started. The Forum Romanum, once the beating heart of Roman political life, had become a theater of psychological warfare. It was now 39 CE, and Caligula's methods had evolved from simple humiliation to a sophisticated system of terror that would make even the most ambitious senator think twice before challenging imperial authority. The emperor's genius lay not in random violence, but in the calculated application of fear. He had studied the weaknesses of the senatorial class, their pride, their wealth, their family connections, and had weaponized each vulnerability with surgical precision. Senator Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the future philosopher and advisor to Nero, witnessed firsthand how Caligula's system operated. During a Senate session discussing provincial taxation, Seneca had made the mistake of suggesting a more moderate approach to tribute collection. The emperor's response was not immediate anger, but a cold smile that chilled the blood of every man present. Within a week, Seneca found himself accused of adultery with Caligula's sister, Julia Livilla. The charge was fabricated, but the process was real. Seneca was forced to endure a public trial where the outcome was predetermined. The emperor was not interested in justice. He was demonstrating that any senator, regardless of their reputation or connections, could be destroyed at his whim. The trial itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Caligula presided personally, not as a judge seeking truth, but as a director orchestrating a performance designed to terrify the other senators. He allowed Seneca to present his defense, creating the illusion of due process, only to render a verdict that everyone knew had been decided before the trial began. But the true brilliance of Caligula's system became apparent in the punishment. Rather than execute Seneca outright, which would have created a martyr, the emperor commuted the death sentence to exile. This act of apparent mercy was actually more cruel than execution. It demonstrated that the emperor controlled not just life and death, but the very terms of survival. The psychological impact on the remaining senators was profound. They realized that their traditional immunities and privileges meant nothing. The emperor could reach into their private lives, destroy their reputations, and strip away everything they had built, all while maintaining the facade of legal proceedings. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who had married Caligula's sister Drusilla, experienced an even more devastating demonstration of imperial power. Despite being part of the imperial family, Lepidus was executed on charges of conspiracy, charges that may have been entirely fabricated. The message was unmistakable. Not even family connections could protect someone from the emperor's wrath. The Senate sessions themselves became exercises in terror. Caligula would arrive unpredictably, sometimes in military dress, sometimes in theatrical costume, always radiating an aura of barely contained violence. He would call upon senators to speak, then interrupt them with questions designed to trap them in contradictions or force them to take positions that could later be used against them. The emperor's understanding of human psychology was remarkable. He realized that uncertainty was more effective than consistent brutality. A senator who knew he would be executed could prepare himself for death, but a senator who never knew when he might be the next target lived in constant fear. The economic dimension of Caligula's warfare against the Senate was equally sophisticated. He imposed enormous taxes on senatorial families, forcing them to sell properties and treasures that had been in their families for generations. This was not just about raising revenue. It was about breaking the economic power that gave senators their independence. Wealthy senators found themselves competing to donate ever larger sums to the imperial treasury, not out of generosity, but out of terror. They hoped that displays of loyalty and financial sacrifice might protect them from the emperor's attention. Instead, these donations only demonstrated their vulnerability and encouraged further demands. The traditional Roman concept of patron-client relationships was turned on its head. Senators, who had once been patrons to hundreds of clients, now found themselves as clients to a single patron, the emperor, who could withdraw his favor at any moment. The entire social structure of Roman society was being reorganized around the principle of imperial dominance. As the machinery of fear reached its full efficiency, it became clear that Caligula was not destroying the Senate out of madness or spite. He was systematically dismantling the last vestiges of the Republic, replacing it with a system where all power flowed from a single source. The senators were not just victims. They were witnesses to the birth of a new kind of Roman state. The Ides of March, 40 CE, marked not just another day in the Roman calendar, but a moment when the full consequences of Caligula's war against the Senate became terrifyingly clear. The emperor's methods had evolved beyond individual punishment into a systematic reconstruction of Roman society itself. The morning session of the Senate revealed the extent of the transformation. Where once hundreds of senators had filled the marble benches of the Curia Julia, now barely half that number remained. Some had died under mysterious circumstances, others had fled to distant provinces, and many had simply withdrawn from public life, preferring obscurity to the constant threat of imperial attention. Those who remained were no longer senators in any meaningful sense. They were performers in an elaborate theatre where the emperor wrote all the scripts and determined all the outcomes. The traditional debates that had once shaped Roman policy were replaced by carefully choreographed displays of submission and praise. Senator Gaius Calvisius Sabinus, a man who had once commanded legions in Germania, now found himself delivering speeches praising the emperor's wisdom in declaring war on Neptune, the god of the sea. The absurdity was intentional. Caligula was demonstrating that he could force even the most accomplished Romans to publicly endorse obvious nonsense. The emperor's genius lay in understanding that the destruction of rational discourse was more effective than the destruction of individuals. By forcing senators to participate in obviously irrational decisions, he was not just humiliating them, he was destroying their capacity for independent thought and action. The economic consequences of this transformation were staggering. The imperial treasury, once managed by careful senatorial oversight, was now entirely at the emperor's disposal. Vast sums were spent on extravagant spectacles, unnecessary construction projects, and bizarre ceremonial events that served no purpose other than to demonstrate the emperor's absolute control over Roman resources. Senator Marcus Crassus Frugi, heir to one of Rome's wealthiest families, had been forced to watch as his ancestral estate was confiscated to fund the emperor's plan to build a permanent bridge across the Bay of Naples. The bridge served no strategic or economic purpose. It existed solely to allow Caligula to ride across the bay in triumphal procession, demonstrating his mastery over nature itself. The psychological impact on Roman society extended far beyond the Senate. Citizens who had once looked to their senators for protection and representation now understood that these traditional intermediaries were powerless. The careful system of checks and balances that had made the Roman Republic possible was being replaced by a single, unpredictable will. Foreign ambassadors and client kings who visited Rome witnessed these transformations with growing alarm. They saw senators who had once negotiated treaties and commanded respect, now reduced to competing for the emperor's favor like courtiers in an oriental despotism. The implications for Rome's international relationships were profound and disturbing. The emperor's treatment of his own family revealed the ultimate logic of his system. When his sister Drusilla died, Caligula declared her a goddess and forced the Senate to vote divine honors for her. This was not grief-driven madness. It was a calculated demonstration that the emperor's will could override even the most fundamental Roman religious traditions. The transformation reached its logical conclusion when Caligula demanded that a statue of himself be placed in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. The order was not motivated by religious conviction, but by the need to demonstrate that his authority extended beyond the boundaries of Roman law and custom into the realm of divine command. The senators who had once prided themselves on their wisdom and political acumen now found themselves trapped in a system where survival required the complete abandonment of rational principles. They were forced to applaud policies they knew were destructive, to praise decisions they understood were insane, and to participate in ceremonies that made mockery of everything they had once held sacred. The final irony was that Caligula's system contained the seeds of its own destruction. By destroying the Senate's capacity for independent action, he had also destroyed the institution that might have provided stability and continuity for the empire. The senators who survived his reign were so traumatized and demoralized that they were incapable of providing effective governance. When the Praetorian Guard finally assassinated Caligula in January 41st CE, they were not just killing a tyrant, they were ending an experiment in absolute power that had revealed the terrible fragility of Roman institutions. The Senate that emerged from his reign was permanently changed, never again able to function as the independent deliberative body that had guided Rome through its greatest achievements. The emperor's war against the Senate was ultimately a war against the very concept of shared governance. His victory was so complete that it fundamentally altered the nature of Roman civilization, creating precedents that would influence the development of imperial authority for centuries to come. The lesson was clear. The destruction of democratic institutions requires not just force, but the systematic corruption of the human capacity for rational political participation. Caligula's genius lay not in his cruelty, but in his understanding that true power comes from the complete submission of the human spirit to arbitrary authority. What did you think of this untold story of Caligula's calculated destruction of the Roman Senate? The historical evidence reveals a far more sophisticated and terrifying ruler than the simple madman of popular legend. If you found this deep dive into Roman political psychology fascinating, make sure to subscribe for more hidden stories from ancient history. Hit that like button if you want to see more content about the dark realities of imperial power, and let me know in the comments which Roman emperor's true story you'd like to explore next.